Hi, I'm Ben from Tussell, and welcome to the Public Sector Sales Podcast. Today we're discussing how to procure innovation. I'm joined today by Rikesh Shah and Ian Brotherston. If you could introduce yourselves, please.
Good afternoon, Ben. So I'm Rikesh Shah. I'm the head of the Innovation Procurement Empowerment Centre, and the centre is there to empower local, regional, and national buyers around how you can use procurement to stimulate more innovation and create more value.
Great to meet you, Rikesh.
Good afternoon, Ben. My name is Ian Brotherston. I'm Interim Deputy Director of Innovation Funding at Innovate UK. Innovate UK is the UK Government's innovation agency. We're part of UK Research and Innovation. One of the products that is in my responsibilities is Contracts for Innovation, which is a methodology to procure innovation.
Okay, well, brilliant. Thank you both for making the time to be here. We'll talk today about how to use procurement to procure innovation. We'll also talk about the Procurement Act and how that may have helped. We'll talk about why it's important to procure innovative solutions. And we'll talk about some practical steps that buyers can take to do that. So Ian, a question for you to begin with. Why is the procurement of innovation so important right now?
It's important right now to think about procuring innovative solutions to ensure that the public sector in particular is making best use of technologies that are coming through. If we procure more innovative solutions, we should be able to get higher efficiency and greater efficacy within the public sector. And of course, with the demands on the budgets, greater efficiency and greater efficacy has never been more important.
And Rikesh, do we know kind of how often the public sector is procuring innovation? The data, do we have that?
Yeah, I think building on what Ian said, we spend about 400 billion a year on public procurement. And my view is ultimately every pound you spend, you should be thinking about innovation. And currently, I still think that we're not spending enough on that diverse supply chain that's come through, whether it's a startup or a scale up or other forms of innovators, or even the large corporates, to really bring that innovation in. And as Ian said, we've got so many challenges in the public sector. We don't have enough money. So answering your question, can we do more? I think absolutely. And I think that's a culture we need to set out.
Brilliant. Let's start talking about practically how procurement teams can go about procuring innovation. How can we do that?
I've worn different hats in the past. So I've been on the seller side, working for startups, or working for corporates. I've also been on the buyer side, so Transport for London, where I was heading up innovation, or now within the Innovation Procurement Empowerment Centre, we're working with both sides of the coin, both the supply side and also the buyer side. And I think that the challenge here is multiple fold. Quite often procurement is used as a barrier for innovation. And I think there is some logic in that, but I think that's too easy to get out. And I think we have procurement processes with the new Procurement Act, but also what we could do previously is you can really use the market to stimulate and bring in innovation that fundamentally creates value. And I think there is a point around defining what we mean by innovation. Innovation isn't invention. It's about creating best value. It's about cheaper, better, quicker, greener outcomes. And with all those challenges that we have, I think we need to set out a process as a buyer of how do I stimulate the market? How do I use all those different tools that are out there to set a signal and say, we want the best innovation to solve some of our challenges and create more value? And that means being that intelligent buyer. And that buyer is never one person. You know, even if I had large budgets in a previous role, I'd have to convince the procurement folk, I'd have to convince the technical folk, the sponsorship team, and anyone else. And that's just the first stage, which is where you're trying to work with the market. Then you procure something, and then you've got to drive the change. So there's a massive systematic approach around transformation that needs to be driven. And that means that the public sector needs to operate much differently. And it means the role of procurement isn't just compliance and just making sure that you're ticking the right boxes from a process point of view. It's about being more entrepreneurial and saying, how can I work with the market completely differently based on outcomes rather than over-prescribing solutions?
Yeah. So I guess that raises the question, how do we bring stakeholders on board? If you work in procurement and you're interested in procuring more innovation, how do you get your team on board with that mission?
I think one of the key words that Rikesh used was outcomes.
Yeah.
And I think we've got to think much more about the real outcome we're aiming for. So, too often, whether it's a commodity, but particularly a service or technology, people just go, oh, we need more of, and blindly do the same thing again or something very similar. They might change the spec a little. And they haven't taken the time between the end users and subject matter experts and commercial and procurement teams to really challenge each other and go, well, what's the outcome we're truly aiming for here? Do I really need to just buy more mobile phones, or is my outcome something entirely different to communication even? Why are we doing that? So I think outcomes is an absolutely key thing. I also talk about the system a lot, and I think there needs to be much earlier and more challenging conversations between commercial and procurement teams and the end users within their organisation. And equally, you need to think about, if you're going to do something different, innovation equals change ultimately. Have you got your business cases? Have you got your programs ready for change? Sometimes that change is quite small. Sometimes that change might be quite radical. But it is about thinking system, but it does start ultimately with what outcome are we aiming for? And I think too often in the public sector, people are so busy delivering, doing business as usual, they almost lose sight of the ultimate outcome they're aiming for. And it's not surprising, we've all been there. We're all so busy turning the handle or making sure we're doing what we're doing. Sometimes we lose sight of the purpose or the mission or the vision of what we're trying to do.
Building on that, it's I think far too often, when it comes to outcomes, and just going back to a previous life, where some of the challenges we had in London is we're trying to get to Vision Zero, which is no deaths or serious injuries on the road network, or we're trying to address air quality challenges in our city, which was 10,000 people a year were suffering from respiratory diseases. These were challenges that we're trying to solve in the traditional manner as Ian set out, and we weren't succeeding. So that means we've got these knotty problems that we need to find new thinking, new ideas. And that means we need to set the conditions for the market to say, how do we work with you to address these challenges? And that means a fundamental shift in terms of being entrepreneurial with the market. It means you're using procurement differently, you're working differently. The systems approach is critical because you can't just do it for one-off things. It's got to be able to scale. And that requires a different type of behavior, a different way of working, which frankly, we're not used to, because my view is sometimes we become institutionalized by the public sector processes, which is we worry about getting things wrong and you worry about the governance. Whereas if that was you buying something at home, if we just use a bit of common sense, you wouldn't be approaching it the same way. But certainly when I wear my uniform at work, I become a certain type of individual and become really nervous about even doing anything that's different. And I think that's what we need to address.
So we need to kind of address the nerves in not wanting to maybe make changes and do things differently. On the topic of process, the Procurement Act's been live for maybe about 3 months at time of record. How does that fit into the equation? Does that help or does that hinder with the procurement of innovation?
I think it helps greatly. I think there's two major aspects for me that will help. Number one is the emphasis on much more pre-market engagement. Now, you could do that previously, but people got really, really scared of it. They got really scared of pre-market engagement because they really thought they were going to clear the pitch, basically. Now, there's been an awful lot of work by Cabinet Office and all of their training about let's do more pre-market engagement. And that goes back to what we were saying earlier, but if you think about the outcome, and you can go to the market and say, these are the outcomes we're looking for, and it will give you some idea whether there are off-the-shelf solutions, whether there's some new innovation that's literally just coming to market, which you could procure, which is known as public procurement innovation, the public being an early adopter, an early buyer, or that there isn't an off-the-shelf solution, but organisations go, if you give us some research or development money, we'll be able to do that with you. And that's what's known as pre-commercial procurement. And I think the opportunity is there to do much more of that. So that pre-market engagement will give the buyers and the supply side good ideas of what solutions are available to hit which outcomes. Related to that, obviously the Act has gone down to only 3 major procedures. And the competitive flexible procedure is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a flexible procedure. Now, it is very new, the Act, and how the competitive flexible procedure is being used is still to be determined. But under that procedure, you can, with relative ease, design a pre-commercial procurement pathway, whether you want to do feasibility studies, whether you want to do demonstration, whatever you want. And I think that those two pieces are absolutely key. And if we can get those changing behaviours embedded, we should get more procurement of innovative solutions.
Well, we're a data company at Tussell. We've looked into whether procurement teams are using the competitive flexible procedure. It's early days, but we kind of early signals that about 20% of above threshold procurements are going through that procurement route, which I think is pretty good for the first few months. In terms of preliminary market engagements, we've also seen a big increase, almost 3/4 of the number of pre-market engagements as compared to tender notices, which is good. I guess that doesn't necessarily speak to the quality, but on a pure kind of numbers basis, that's potentially a positive sign.
And I think on the Procurement Act, we've got to be real here. There's lots of other things that have come in, which means the pressure on a commercial officer has increased significantly. Notices they have to publish, got the reporting. So I think initially, my innovation head says, let's just get on with it. Let's do the innovation. But I realize there's lots of change. And so we've got to give it a bit of time. But what I'm hoping is commercial managers and organizations use this as an opportunity to really think about best value. And otherwise, the risk is if they revert back to what we were doing before, it will be very compliance heavy. And what I mean by that is, some of the things around the most advantageous tender versus the most economically advantageous tender. Well, let's move away from simply measuring on cost, particularly if you want better outcomes. I think the emphasis on social value is really good, but I think we need to be much better at defining what we mean by social value. I think the piece around pre-market engagement, Ian's absolutely right. But what we've got to make sure is, I remember in an old life when we did pre-market engagement, you have to sign up to this portal. You get onto this portal, you've got to register. You make it really hard for a supplier who's never engaged with the market or the public sector to actually be part of the ecosystem. So how do we get better at being open and saying, these are the big problems I have, who in the market can actually help us with it? And if you've got good ideas, how do we genuinely use pre-market engagement as an exercise to inform a specification? Because quite often a pre-market engagement activity is being used to justify what I've already got in my mind. And I think we need to be able to challenge each other internally and say, is there a different way or a better way to do this? And I completely agree with the competitive flexible procedure, that multi-staged approach. But what I'm hoping here is when it comes to the data, we also understand who's actually using it for genuine innovation, because now it's harder to measure because it's under a CFP. So how do we sort of better use data to understand, is the competitive flexible procedure working for innovation or not? And at the moment, I think we've got a gap in that space.
I think there's one other thing I'd like to add there as well. And I think the pipeline notices in some instances will be really important. Now, if I remember correctly, it's if you've got a procurement budget over £100 million, you're meant to publish what it's roughly going to be. And I say roughly because things do change. And if you're in pre-market engagement, that pipeline might change. But that will help in some very large procurements. But a lot of the procurements that we're talking where we think there's the opportunity for much more procurement of innovation, whether it's pre-commercial procurement innovation, probably won't fall under those pipelines notices, but we do definitely want people to think about that pre-market engagement. So one of the key things for me is both the contract managers and the end users not waiting to within 6 months of a particular contract coming to an end and going, I need more of that. They engage earlier in the process. Now, as Rikesh rightly pointed out, there is actually a lot more things initially for procurement and commercial teams to do. I think that will slowly wash through into business as usual as people get used to it and it become quicker, and there will be other ways to assist. But we do need those teams to work earlier together to take the most advantage of what we've now got.
I think coming back to that point around pipeline, I think we've got to find a way with the service owners in the organization, the finance teams and the procurement teams to really 2 or 3 years ahead. So where are those challenge areas? What tenders are coming up where we can actually think about them and design them differently? I agree with Ian. The way sometimes it works, it's like a conveyor belt. This thing's coming up for renewal. Do we just do the same again? Is it a retender? And I think that word retender is not right, because if you would have procured that 5 years ago, your specification generally should be different. And being different, the only way you can define it by being different or inform it is by the pre-market engagement. But if you haven't got the time to do that and you've got that service to keep on running, the easy answer is let's just buy the same again. And what happens then is generally the incumbent would win the contract.
Well, so on that, what are the major barriers there? Is it risk aversion? Is it a culture issue? Is it time? Or is it concerns about budget? I'm wondering kind of what you think the main...
I would say all of the above, but budget is actually probably the least of the concerns. Because
Okay.
people know their budgets within reason. But I think it is, there is risk aversion, something that I've become more and more aware of the longer I've been in my job and working around contracts innovation, is it's how scared people are of challenge.
Yeah.
And it can paralyse the public sector entirely. And it's one of the reasons why under the old regime, it became a box ticking exercise. Tick this box, tick this box, tick this box, tick this box. And it's something that Cabinet Officers try to move away from the new Act as much as they can, while knowing that we've got to be compliant. We're talking about public money here, and we're also talking about not conveying competitive advantage or guarding against fraud simply. So, but resource and time and the way of working, it's a culture change, it's a change of behaviour. And one of the things I noticed during the training that's been done for procurement experts and procurement professionals is a real range of sort of like responses. I was on one training course where half of the people on it said, what's happening to my frameworks? That's all they're worried about, is can I still use my same old framework?
Yeah.
Now, frameworks I could go on about forever, but I won't do right now.
Well, do they block innovation?
Oh, frankly, yes, too often.
Yeah.
I do know that under the new Act, people are trying to be a bit more open about use of frameworks. So on average, they will block innovation in certain spheres. If your framework is there about buying your fruit and veg and milk commodity, it's a kind of thing, fine, great. If you've got frameworks for IT, of which there's plenty, you're probably blocking innovation. You're probably blocking different solutions. So frameworks are an issue, but there were some procurement professionals who couldn't wait for the new Act to come in, so they could feel the shackles coming off. They were really enthusiastic about using competitive flexible in particular. So there is a range there, but ultimately it's a systems behaviour piece. Risk aversion is definitely there. It's definitely there, but the culture is more important, and that culture change needs to be driven both top down. You need the most senior officers saying, look, using procurement is a real opportunity to change and get better outcomes, but also driven from the bottom up, and people working with each other and understanding the outcomes, and also understanding limitations that procurement teams and commercial teams, there's only so many of them. Yeah. So work them, engage them earlier, and you'll probably get a better tender notice than going forward.
3 quick points from me.
Oh, go on.
Because I think what Ian said there, I don't disagree. I think the first one is around, I'll touch on frameworks. The other one I'd like to touch on is stakeholder management. And then the third one is some of the barriers. So perhaps starting with the stakeholder management first, is if you're a politician, what you want is you want to make sure your manifesto commitments are delivered. So open innovation or market innovation makes sense because you're diversifying the types of ideas. If you're a business, so a budget holder, you want to make sure you're getting value for money. So again, by going to the market, you can compare if you're doing internal innovation versus external innovation and see where the value is. If you're a procurement colleague, you want to be creative, surely, and curious as a category manager. So again, market innovation makes sense. And so if we think about all these, and the supply side, they're saying, actually, tell us where you want us to invest our R&D budgets so we can work with you and solve those public sector problems. So it makes absolute sense to all these different stakeholders of working with the market and the public sector working with the market. but we still don't do it in the manner where we make it easy for the market to work with us. I think in terms of frameworks, I totally agree. The nature of innovation is you don't know what you're buying. You know what outcome you want. A framework is restricting you based on the type of category. So you're immediately, just by its nature, inhibiting innovation to a degree. I don't mind transformative innovation with the framework, not iterative innovation through the framework, because of course you want every provider to be innovating in the cloud space or in the API space or whatever it is. But what you shouldn't be doing at the same time is then restricting the market, who's got some really different new ideas, but because you're using the framework, they can't come in. And then the point around cultural barriers, the barriers to innovation, I think culture is absolutely right. I mean, when I was doing some of my old jobs, I'd worry about what the mayor might say to me, or I worry about what the media might write tomorrow, or you worry about that stakeholder that's giving you a headache to say he's going to give you, or she's going to give you more of a headache. But the other area is the internal alignment. I had colleagues internally that would say, if it's not my idea, it's not a good idea. So you've got these organizational silos, and you have to convince all of them that this innovation will work. And all it takes is the tech person to say, sorry, can't integrate it in my systems. Or the HR person to say, sorry, that's a business change. You've got to get new people. We haven't got budgets for headcount. So you're then driving that. And then the other area is just driving that change internally, which is going through that pathway. And if you're bringing a particular startup in that's not used to working with a corporate, it's a very different transition to even a big corporate. So I think there are we're just not used to it. We're not set up to deal with it. And I think, frankly, we need to throw the playbook out a bit and start with a new one of how do we be more entrepreneurial and engage with the market differently.
And there's one last thing I'd like to add. I was talking to an economist about this. An economist, and you always start with what's the motivation? So what is the motivation for people to change? So we need to be very clear why we want to do something. So what are, say, the outcomes we're aiming for, but why are they motivating to people, particularly on the front lines? The frontline service delivery people are quite often suspicious about change simply because it hasn't been explained to them properly, or the motivations behind the change. And therefore you don't get the buy-in to what is a change program ultimately. So motivation throughout that system is really important to understand. So that sort of like goes hand in hand with understanding what outputs and outcomes you're aiming for. What's the motivation? Why are we trying to change how we deliver X, Y, Z service?
I think that's a great point. How do we empower the people that are feeling the pain? And that could be procurement, but it could be a policy change. It could be a process change. It could be just, how do you make their life easier to be able to make the best decisions? And at the moment, I think the system inhibits people from being creative and entrepreneurial or curious. So the easy answer is I'm not incentivized to think differently. I'll carry on with the status quo. And that's not good enough for the public sector that's desperate to solve these challenges.
So I have a question on this idea of categories and the siloed nature that procurement can take. Some people might think innovation is not for my category. Maybe I work in the States or FM, and innovation is about AI, and innovation is about digital infrastructure. What would you say to that?
I would say that there's potential for innovation nearly everywhere. Nearly everywhere. FM is a great example. FM, the latest use of sensors actually, and it does AI in the sensors, etc. You could probably make it much more efficient. Much more efficient. You're not having to do inspections you have to do. You aren't carrying out maintenance just because time's up. You're carrying out maintenance because your sensors, your programs, etc. are telling you that's going to wear out in the next 10 weeks. You better go and service it now. There is innovation to be had everywhere. In service, one of the best changes was that HMRC got was when they just changed the wording in their letter. They changed the word, the letter, the actual meaning of the letter was exactly the same, but the way they presented it was very different. They got better response rates.
I think when it comes to innovation, sometimes there's a monopoly with our tech folk and engineering folk who think they want to invent. And I think innovation, as Ian's rightfully pointed out, could come from anywhere. And as a result, I think it's a philosophy and it's a way of working. to be curious, to push the boundaries, to be innovative. And that means the innovation doesn't have to be that widget, doesn't have to be that big transformative thing. It could be anywhere. And I think if as soon as you create that culture, the big and the small things will just come in naturally.
So I do want to ask about contracts for innovation, this route for driving innovation through procurement. Can you talk us through that, Ian?
Yes, so Contracts for Innovation used to be known as a Small Business Research Initiative. Ultimately, it's a procurement methodology. It's not something Innovate UK own, but it's something we basically, for want of a better phrase, curate for UK government. It works perfectly well and fits under the competitive flexible procedure. And it's really really a pre-commercial procurement mechanism. But you can take it now all the way through to actually procuring at the end. But what it is when a organisation has a challenge or an outcome it needs to meet, and it's been determined via pre-market engagement or wider knowledge that there is not a solution on the market currently. So that the demand side will, in simple terms, start a competition with a very, very defined problem, but not a solutionized way of putting it. So the problem is kept quite open. And normally the first stage is it basically asks people with small amounts of money to do feasibility studies. And for example, let's say you've got a problem and you might say I'm going to make up numbers here because the numbers are a bit how long's a piece of string, but you might say you've got £100,000 for feasibility studies, we fund 10 feasibility studies at £10,000. And so therefore quite small amounts of money, but it's a contract and it's payment on delivery, but the delivery and the milestones are relatively flexible because it's feasibility. If there is some feasibility studies that look promising, you then might go to what we call phase 2, which is sort of like an R&D phase. So what you do is you then run a closed competition for, let's say, 7 of those 10 have shown that their feasibility has promise. You then maybe do, say, 7 contracts at £150,000 each, making up numbers again, could be noughts either way on these kind of things, depending on what your problem is. And those organisations do a much bigger project with set milestones through it, payment on delivery of those milestones, but you're seeing how the problems are developing. Crucially, that the demand side are involved in these projects, even if it's just what we would call monitoring, but certainly so they can see how these are not just developing, but they can start thinking about the integration, the system, and slowly if they need to put a few parameters on. And depending on how far you get through that stage, you might then be able to either procure a solution that's never existed before, or you might need to go into trial and demonstration phase and do a further phase. But you basically have a funnel that goes from a very open problem and quite a number of feasibility studies that slowly comes down to a few solutions that are developed, maybe all the way to market. And while you're coming down this funnel, the sort of like the size and the shape of each contract, of each project is getting bigger. And hopefully you should get to the end where you as a public sector buyer can now buy something that didn't exist before that solves your problem. For Innovate UK, the motivation is twofold. Number one, it's working with our public sector partners and getting more procurement in. But number two, this is actually procuring new work, new innovation, new research in the private sector organisations. So for Innovate UK, the motivation isn't just to help our public sector colleagues and partners deliver better, different, more efficient, higher efficacy outcomes or solve something entirely new, but we're also stimulating private sector innovation. We are basically stimulating businesses to do something new and different themselves. More often than not, the innovations that are being stimulated won't just have a public sector buyer. There are places where the public sector will be the only buyer, but even where they are, there are different parts of the public sector in the UK, around the world, who probably have a similar issue. But importantly, most of the businesses are developing a new product or service or learning something about their current product or service as they innovate, which helps them sell into their private sector markets as well. So it's a win-win situation, and it's one of the reasons why some government departments use the contract innovation methodology in quite early stages where they might not even be the end user, but they know other parts of the public sector probably will be.
So do you have an example we could take a look at?
I have lots and lots of examples, and I'm trying to think of the best one. I think an example that I really like, and it's if you look up Trends Report,
Yes.
they were basically a company formed for the sole purpose of what was then an SBRI call regarding how to assist disabled passengers on the rail network.
Yeah.
I'm cutting a long story short here, but they developed an app that is now used across the entire UK rail system, but the company was formed just to develop this app and deliver it. It saves the rail operating companies money, interestingly, because under the old system, if someone with mobility issues wanted to use the rail network, it was all done on a manual process where people had phoned up, pieces of paper written down, and quite often not, because it was a very manual process, the poor person who with mobility issues was forgotten about and wasn't able to get on the train they were meant to be booked on, or even get to the platform. And actually the rail operating companies were fined every time this went wrong. The app has automated this to a stage where basically everyone has the app, it pings, tells them they've got someone they need to assist, they can assist. Transreport though are now using the app not just in the rail network, but Heathrow Airport. I think Japanese airports are using it. They've gone from 1 employee. The last time I spoke to Transreport, they were up to 40 employees. So it's been a win-win of what was, in some respects, quite a small problem. And this goes back to the earlier question about, is it always big tech? This actually was relatively simple tech, but clever use of the tech. And really understanding what the end users, both the end user in terms of the person with mobility issues, but also the person in the public sector, and originally the rail operating companies and staff at stations, what they needed to see as well. But I think it's a fantastic case study. Do Google Transreport. You'll find it written up as a case study in various places, both on IPEC site, Innovate UK's Contracts for Innovation site, and Transreport themselves have a fantastic LinkedIn page, which I was going to have a look at.
I'll check that out. So where can people find this methodology and how can people start using it?
The Contracts for Innovation methodology is probably the best place to look is on the Innovate UK Business Connect site. Again, put into Google Innovate UK Business Connect Contracts for Innovation. It will take you to the site. That then gives you the contact details also to contact us from my team, and we can discuss with you if you're particularly on the public sector side how you can use the methodology. Is it for you? It's not for everyone. Very much there on that pre-commercial procurement where you do have a real problem where you're pretty sure there's nothing on market. It is a very simple methodology. We worked very closely with the Cabinet Office during procurement reform to make sure it was folded into the procedures. And my team are more than happy to explain and talk anyone through it.
If you have one tip, Rikesh, for people watching this, an actionable thing they can do tomorrow to start this conversation or procure more innovation, what would that be?
I would encourage people to visit ipec.org.uk, where we've got a series of toolkits, guidance, but also you can join our cohort programs, whether you're on the buyer side or the seller side. And we're really thankful to Innovate UK, who are funding IPEC, to really help us drive procurement and innovation. Because frankly, as I said at the beginning, we're desperate to bring market innovation into solving some of the UK's key challenges.
Brilliant. Well, I've asked Rikesh, so I'll ask you too, Ian, if you have one tip or practical piece of advice that you would give a procurement professional who really wants to start procuring more innovation, what would that be?
Work with your end users, subject matter experts, to really understand what outcomes they really want. not just the outcomes they've currently got that they might want N+1, but say, well, if you had a magic wand, what's the real outcome you want?
Brilliant. Thank you, Rikesh. Thank you, Ian, for joining us today. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow their various links. They'll be linked in the description below.